Hey there.
Greetings!
How's it going?
Hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to Underqualified, everybody, a podcast that still is not a podcast, but thank you
Nope.
for joining us on this now video show. As always, for those of you who are new, I'll briefly run you through the rules. I'm getting better at this. Rule number 1, we will only say things that are true to the best of our brief knowledge and research. Number 2, if you are someone who knows better about whatever it is that we are talking about and we say something that's wrong, or you just have something to contribute to the conversation, you're required as a participant of this podcast and by law to tell us very nicely in the comments what you have to add to the story. Number 3, sort of a run off of that one, just be nice. We're going to do our best, but the show is called Underqualified, so if we get things wrong, it's kind of how things go.
That's the whole idea.
We're going to go in a slightly different direction than we have been in some of the previous episodes, which have been a lot of like hard science empirical data and then discussing that.
Also, our last episode was pretty heavy in terms of topics.
True.
And so we're hoping that today, although yours is still, it's got some heavy portions to it, but I'm just talking about Mario. So it's going to be good, wholesome, fun content.
Yep.
No need for trigger warnings on this episode. So
I'm going to be talking about the discussion and the research behind whether or not video games cause violence, which, as you might imagine, in a study of something that is inherently, what's the word that I'm looking for? It is empirical, but studying humans psychologically is very complicated. The answer has a lot of facets, and there's a lot of things that we still don't understand. Excuse me. So I'll jump in right away and say the thing that is generally accepted, which is that if you play any sort of game with any sort of violence, be that anything from like Fortnite to Doom. So Fortnite would be...
Those are very different flavors of violence.
So Fortnite being very colorful and cartoony and not seeming very real, and Doom being, chainsawing zombies in hell while heavy metal music plays. That's the sort of the distinction here. Mm-hmm. Both cause a short-term increase in aggression that appears to be equal.
Oh, really?
So we'll start with that.
The realism of the violence
does not seem to matter.
Interesting.
To the point that college-age students who were exposed to an E-rated game, which for those of you who are not gamers, E is for everyone, meaning that like kids and of all ages and all age groups should be able to play this without being affected negatively. Still experienced a significant increase in aggression playing a quote-unquote violent E-rated game. Now, how violent is a game that's rated E? Probably not very. But
I was thinking like Whack-A-Mole.
Right.
As far as
that is something that you can lose a little bit of the context sometimes because these studies tend to not say the name of the video game that they actually used, because then you get into copyright situations. But by and large, that result of if you play anything that has violence in it, there will be an associated increase in your aggressive levels for a brief period following your stopping playing whatever game it is that you're playing.
Do you know how they're measuring level of aggression in those studies? Is it subjective? Or are they like, how mad are you right now? Or
yeah, so I do have a couple specific studies pulled up here, and so I can tell you that in this first one, which is a study from Joseph Hilgard of Illinois State University and colleagues, the way that they measured aggression was how long the person who had played the video game told their counterpart to shove their hand in a bucket of ice water while completing a task.
Wow.
And that seems a little bit strange. So let's dig into this study a little bit, because it's really interesting. And I'll spoil it a little bit and say that this particular study did not find an increase in overtly aggressive behavior in the context of telling someone to keep their arm in a bucket of ice water for a really long time based on how violent the game was. So what they used They actually tell us they used Doom 2. So not a current version of Doom. Like Doom Eternal came out last year, I think, but an older, more dated version. And they actually came up with 4 different iterations. So there was sort of the standard version, and then there were some that had a mod added in called Brutal Doom, which made the game more violent and more difficult. So that this study talked about if playing a difficult video game or a violent video game changed the result. So like, do you get really, really mad and aggressive when you can't beat something, or is it just the violence itself?
Yeah.
And so in some, it was made more difficult or more violent, and then there are some lesser versions that were made substantially less difficult but with the same amount of gore as the original Doom, and then a last version where they took the alien enemies from Chex Quest, which, if you're like, Chex, isn't that the snack brand? Yes, Chex has a video game that is not particularly violent at all, and so there would have been no gore. And so you would be sending them home rather than killing them. So lots of different ways that this could have happened. But they brought in, I think they said 275 college-age students. And they had them write a paper, a brief 5-minute writing assignment in which they describe their views on abortion.
Okay.
Which kind of out there, but I think what they're looking for was something that's extremely polarizing. And then each participant received a rating, which was actually fake. And so they received another participant's essay that was fake, and they received a review that was fake that basically said, "This is terrible," and it included the exact quote, "This is the stupidest thing I have ever read." So the idea is to get them feeling aggressive before they play the game, and then see what the impact is post-game. So after that, they were allowed to play the game for 15 minutes on whichever of those 4 that I had just described to you they were assigned to. And then after that, let me see. Reading from this article here, and I want to make sure that I get it right. So after they had played for that period, they got their feedback on the essay, and then the aggression was measured by having them engage in an exercise that supposedly examined decision-making under distraction. As part of the exercise, participants chose how long their partner had to keep his hand in the water while performing a task. That's what I was thinking of. So the idea was you get them playing this violent game, you tell them that you disagree with their opinion and that they wrote about it really poorly, regardless of what their opinion was. Their opinion was pointless, essentially. And then see how long they punished this random person for being frustrated that whoever was reading this didn't like their paper.
Yeah.
And so this particular study found that the aggressive outcome was the same pretty much across the board. And you might say, well, there's a confounding variable there, because if you're just really tilted that somebody didn't like what you had to say, you might be aggressive regardless. And that's true. That's mentioned at the end of this paper. But those are issues that we run into with studying humans pretty much on any level. It's really hard to get an empirical study done that, you can't come back and be like, well, isn't this part of the question? And you'd be like, yes, it is, but we just weren't able to cover whatever blank is. They do mention that some of the data was thrown out because people who were doing the study figured out what the study was about and told the researchers. Which, I mean, I probably would have been one of those people. I would have been like, is this supposed to make me angry? Because this has been discussed pretty much since the inception of violent video games, which, I mean, like 30 years ago or longer even. Yeah. And it appeared that the difficulty as well played no part in it. So the difficulty or the violence levels seem to have the exact same impact on the way that they reacted. This is a more general study that says that talks about how the overarching experimental research has shown that video games do in fact increase violence in the long term, and it talks about how the struggles that a lot of these larger studies have had, well, and just studies in general. And the first is that, let's see, who is this by? This is called The Effect of Violent Video Games on Aggression. Is it more than just the violence? And it was published by Paul J.C. Adachi and Tina Willoughby. So, again, this is not my research. I am quoting from this study that I pulled up here. The majority of experimental studies have compared the effects of violent versus non-violent video games on aggression, have failed to equate these games in terms of competitiveness, difficulty, and pace of action. And so there's a lot going on there. You know, how hard is the game? Are you playing against other people, or are you playing against the computer? Because you can have very different responses to that. You know, I can attest to playing on Fortnite and getting killed in a way that seems ridiculous. And of course, if you're playing Fortnite, that's only against other people,
players.
And that can be frustrating a lot faster than just losing because the game is difficult to like an enemy AI. And pace of action. You know, some games are like a more episodic story-based slow burn kind of thing with bursts of violence and action, and others kind of hit you continuously. And so, although the common finding is that violent video games do produce higher levels of aggression than non-violent video games, it can be hard to say why.
Right.
And then it goes on to say, other unmatched factors beyond the actual violent content may be responsible for elevated levels of aggression. It's been really difficult to pin down if your intrinsic aggression level is impacted by the violentness of the video game. So everybody gets more aggressive after playing aggressive video games, but it does seem in some studies like people who are inherently more aggressive receive sort of a synergistic effect from playing those violent video games. So those of us who, you know, if you're pretty laid back and chill a lot of the time, you'll get, you know, the 1x response. But if someone who sort of operates on a more high-strung aggressive level might get like the 2.5x response, you know, where they react a lot more substantially.
Right. And this is all talking about just very short-term levels of aggression.
Right.
It's immediately after you stop playing and how you're feeling in that moment. And so a study talking about long-term levels of aggression and long-term use of violent video games would be a very different design.
It would be a very different design, and they do talk about that in this last article that I have here, and it's really hard to pin down because there's a whole area of study in what's called media violence. And the concern with video games is that the violence that is occurring and being perpetrated is done by you. And so it's distinct from movies or TV shows in that in the movies or TV shows you are simply just witnessing the violence occur on screen. But in video games, you are either your character is either directly experiencing the violence or directly perpetrating the violence on others. And so that raises a concern for the youth of the world, essentially, who are the ones who are more likely to be playing video games. You know, is that substantially different than just seeing it on TV? How would you even quantify that?
Right.
You know, is it the number of fatalities that happen in the TV show? Is it the amount of gore? You know, is a PG-13 movie versus an R-rated movie that has blood more violent? There's not really an answer to that question. You would just have to make a statistical decision. I would say that it is, because the gore adds a level of realism that might be more impactful.
But just reflecting on my experiences with both of those kinds of movies, my personal reaction to seeing the violence is very different, depending on the film.
Yeah.
You know, like the super clean Marvel Avengers violence is wow, that's a cool action scene versus a movie such as, I'm just spitballing with examples here, like John Wick.
Oh, John Wick,
Keanu
for sure,
Reeves.
is extremely violent.
There are many scenes that are just like, oh gosh,
right,
like, oh man, what did he just do to that human?
Yeah.
And so those feel very differently just experiencing them, but I don't know if long term, like, there's a difference in how the consumption of that media impacts the consumer.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's a body of research for that either. But
so one of the biggest issues with this discussion as a whole is bias. And I will say up front that I am someone who really loves to play video games. So I really probably honestly should not be talking about this because I am extremely biased. I think that video games have a lot of good to offer. And I enjoy playing them as a expenditure of my time, as a way to relax and calm down. Other people are very against video games, in particular parents that are concerned about the behavior or just the growth and learning of their children. Rightfully so. I would not let my 5-year-old play Call of Duty.
Yeah.
You know, if I had a child that was that age, I would not let them play a game of that level. But at the same time, there's people who will go so far as to say, well, these games shouldn't even be made. You know? And so there's a lot of spin that occurs with this research.
Yeah.
Which makes it hard to talk about. Because you start formulating opinions based on results that may or may not implicate those opinions, you know? Mm-hmm. So should we treat video games the exact same way as we treat movies? You know? Because I can tell you that after watching, like, The Incredible Hulk or something, I left the movie being like, you know, let's tussle, you know? Yeah. And then 15 to 20 minutes later, I was fine. And there seems to be a similar effect with playing violent video games. And we do already have a rating system for video games that is very similar to the way that movies are rated. And so it can be really hard to pin down, is that it? Yeah. Right? You know, do you just get that 15 to 20 minutes of feeling really amped up after you play the video game and then you're done? For some people that might be true, for some people that might not be true. And you have to take into consideration their entire sphere of existence and their personal experiences when you're tabulating how big of an impact that is. Mm-hmm. And so that's when media violence gets really hard to talk about. Mm-hmm. Because to simply say, well, this person is only going to play video games and this person's only going to watch violent movies. Well, now you've got an ethical concern, right? Because you're controlling the way that someone experiences the world. And so that's just a study that's probably never going to happen. And so longitudinal correlational studies about violence in video games, longitudinal meaning over a period of years, are really hard to render concrete results. Mm-hmm. Because if that person is playing violent video games but is also watching CSI, NCIS, every Jason Bourne movie, you know, all of those other violent forms of media, who's to say that one of those is more responsible for their aggressive behavior than any of the other things?
Right. There's so many lurking variables that we're not trying to test. And that's sort of getting into what you were talking about, but the difficulties of working with humans as means of research.
Right.
So
so this is from the American Psychological Association, APA.org, and it's an extensive article by Dr. Craig A. Anderson, and I might link this at the bottom of the video if I remember to do it, because it's a really extensive piece that talks about 11 different myths with studies of video games causing violence. And then at the very end, it covers the theory and then some of the problems that I have been talking about.
Yeah.
But the general thing that it talks about in those sort of busting those myths, and I'm going to take it at its word because it's published in APA.org. Maybe I'm trusting a little bit blindly, but if it's on APA.org, I'm going to trust that it's
good enough for
decently reliable.
I'm quoting Wikipedia 3 times. So.
And the general consensus of all of those myths is what I have mentioned. If you play a video game that has any sort of violence in it, you will be aggressive for a period of time following ceasing playing that video game. The length of time and the amount of aggression seems to vary based on the individual, but there seems to be an increase in aggression regardless of age, which was interesting to me because we always talk about, well, we shouldn't be letting kids play Call of Duty, which I just said a few minutes ago that if I had, a 5-year-old, I wouldn't let them play Call of Duty. But the increase in aggression seems to happen regardless. So it happens with college-age kids, it happens with adults, it happens with geriatrics population. Everybody gets more aggressive.
I think there's more concern maybe with young children because they just have fewer skills for controlling their emotions,
right.
And so you're operating at that higher level of aggression. You don't have the processing skills to deal with that and come down off of it as quickly, maybe. So maybe it's more that's in line with how you're responding to your feelings and to your emotions rather than the differences in how those emotions come about. I don't know if that made sense, but
no, absolutely. And so it talks about towards the end of this piece sort of what I was saying about how much spin gets applied to this research, because one of the defenses of the video game community is to say that, well, if video games are making the youths more violent, then there should be an increase in the violent crime rate in the US specifically. I don't know why it wouldn't affect the rest of the world, but I guess we're talking about US audiences right now. So that's flawed for a number of reasons. Because first of all, that would imply that the only violent media that is being consumed by the young population is video games, which of course that's not true. The second would imply that the youth crime rate is decreasing, which that's hard to study, and there isn't evidence that it is. And that exposure to violent media, including video games, is going up. And there's no suggestion to say that that's true either. We're consuming approximately the same amount of violent media. Let's see. It says that the first assumption is probably true. We are probably consuming more violent media than we were 20 to 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But, how do you pin that down? Again, it's studying humans. These are things that are really hard to pin down. And then, like I said, there isn't really evidence that the youth crime rate has gone down, and there is absolutely no way to quantify whether or not video games are the only thing that people are experiencing. So that argument is basically completely ridiculous.
Right. Well, and forgive me if you're going to get to this later, but looking outside of the US, there are countries who play video games at a much higher rate than in the United States on average. And those countries, without being able to name them specifically, have lower violent crime rates than the U.S. in general.
That does happen in some instances.
Yeah.
This is going to be extremely American-centric just because this is the American Psychology Association.
Right.
So I'm not really going to address worldwide, but I probably should have.
Right. But I think the countries that, that play video games, there's a big market like in Germany and in South Korea. And I know for a fact, I can't quote the statistics, but they have lower violent crime rates in the United States.
Yeah.
Because our violent crime rate is fairly high in comparison with other developed nations. So just in general, in terms of that argument, that's not really what we see happening played out in a practical sense, I suppose. But that doesn't necessarily disprove a link between violent video games and aggression in general.
Well, and it just goes to show how hard it is to pin down, right? There's so many other variables that are involved. So the things that have been proven to be statistically true: aggressive thoughts increase. What's called aggressive affect increases. So the longer you play. General arousal, and what they mean by that is not physical, but or sexual, but like your heart rate. So you get, if you're playing a really adrenaline-inducing game, which game developing companies have really leaned into, so games that get your heart rate up and get your blood flowing and make you, rah. And then direct imitation of recently observed aggressive behavior will sometimes occur. So that's exactly what I was talking about, watching an action movie and feeling like, you're gonna get in a bust-up with somebody on the street or whatever. And so all of that is pretty cut and dry. That does occur. But like I've said, that's really no different from watching violent TV or movies. And it's hard to quantify statistical levels of aggression. Right. We can say, oh, well, they get more aggressive, but it's really hard to pin down. You know, he is approximately 33% more aggressive than he was before he watched that action movie. You know, like, what? And so to sort of wrap things up here, we'll talk about the unanswered questions. And the first one that they talk about is those longitudinal studies over an extended period of time on how that impacts people. Because I would argue that very few gamers play exclusively violent content. Excuse me. You know, so I really enjoy, I don't know, gosh, Pokemon. Does Pokemon count as violent content?
Yes.
Maybe. It doesn't really make me aggressive.
I mean, I don't know. When you're in the heat of battle in the Elite Four and you knock out the last Pokemon, there's a little, like, yeah, kind of feeling to that. But it's certainly not graphic by any means.
And then, you know, there's things like Animal Crossing, which is incredibly popular. Yeah. Minecraft is not inherently violent. You can play it in ways that you are fighting enemies, but they're always creatures. It's never people. So there's all of that media that isn't violent. And then there's stuff like Doom, which literally the tagline of Doom is how violent it is. That's why people play the game. Like, there's heavy metal playing while you are running through hell with a shotgun and a chainsaw. You know, does that game have a more substantial effect on aggression? It would seem like it probably should.
It seems logical.
And then, like I mentioned earlier, another gap, which is potentially the largest gap, is the effect of television versus video games. Yeah. Because people will get so up in arms about video games because you're playing the action. You know, you are the perpetrator of the violence versus just the witness of the violence on television. And because of that, that's sort of the theoretical premise, is that in all likelihood it's going to make you more aggressive and have a larger impact on you because you are doing it.
Right.
But that is almost impossible to test. Because, like I said, you can't just tell someone to never watch TV ever. And this talks about what does equivalent mean? On what dimension should they be equivalent? The number of bodies, the amount of blood and gore, realism of the images. That's 3 examples that's directly quoting from here. There are a few unpublished correlational studies that compare the effects of television and video games. But the issue, those haven't been published, so the faith in them is probably going to be a little bit reduced.
Yeah.
From otherwise, you know, it says right here that they yielded results suggesting a somewhat larger effect of video game violence. But that's something that's very much up in the air at this point. And then on the most basic level, what quantifies human aggression? You know, there are several studies that have been found to be flawed because what the person was getting quote unquote aggressive at was competitiveness, and that is a very different thing. So, you know, you want to win as opposed to, you know, get in a fight with somebody.
You could have the same sort of increase in aggression from playing a sport as from playing a video game, potentially, if it's just competitiveness.
And then things like the process that underlies short and long-term exposure to media violence, and then just continuing to try and broaden these models to undercut as many of these issues as possible. So I think if I remember, I'll do my best to post this in the description of the video. I think it's worth everyone reading and forming your own opinions of. As I said, this is an extremely bias-laden issue. I admit to my own. Don't trust anyone who says that they have no bias, really with regards to any issue. But this issue seems particularly prone to people forming extremely strong opinions on not particularly strong data. I'll put it that way.
It does seem to be polarizing in sort of an interesting way. I don't know that we respond to media consumption in other forms in that same sort of polarized way. Like, the quality of the TV shows that different generations are watching. I don't know that there's that same kind of tension there. But yeah, for whatever reason with video games, it seems like it's really hard to have a conversation about. And I think that, since we can't really draw a conclusion off of the data, it's probably safest to operate under the assumption that video games are like anything else, which is that some amount of consumption is not harmful,
right.
But an overconsumption can potentially be harmful if you're an individual that is predisposed to aggression and you're also playing 9 hours of Call of Duty a day.
Right.
That's probably not going to be healthy. It's not going to necessarily mean that you're going to go out and be violent, but there's, that there's room for improvement in that living situation. So just everything in moderation, guys.
Yeah.
Underqualified fam. Just you do you. Live healthy.
I would say that it's still a generational thing because we are just now really starting to get a large number of people who are now having children and raising children who they themselves played video games when they were young.
Right.
And so it is absolutely the newest by a large margin of those three media forms, so movies, TV, and video games. And so I think that, of course, a concern for the health and the future of your child is at the forefront. And then for those parents who never played video games in their lives and they don't understand why their child is obsessed with playing X game,
right?
The lack of understanding. But, at the same time, I would not let my child watch Terminator for 10 hours a day, and I would probably not let them play Call of Duty for 10 hours a day. So just as you said, if you were doing anything in the dark alone for hours on end, it's probably not going to be good for you.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you all to formulate your own opinions about that and let us know what you think.
Yeah, let us know if we're totally wrong about that. If you think that playing 9 hours of Call of Duty every day is like perfect for you, I would love to hear your story, honestly. So perfect. That was great. We let Nicholas's time go a little bit longer today because I was jumping in maybe more than I usually do, but we also very lighthearted just wanted to run through. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Nintendo as a general company, and then lots and lots about Mario, which I'm super excited about. Because,
one of the most iconic characters of all time, I would argue.
And absolutely central to both of our childhoods.
Absolutely.
The amount of Mario media that we have consumed is frankly overwhelming.
Extensive.
And so first of all, let's just talk a little bit about Nintendo in general, which is the company that produces the Mario games, if you're unfamiliar, but I think most people are fairly familiar with Nintendo on some level. And there is a lot that I did not know about this company. For instance, the fact that it is like 140 years old.
Yeah.
And so Yamauchi Nintendo, please forgive if you speak Japanese, forgive my pronunciation. Leave a comment that says, hey.
Here's the phonetic spelling of how to say that word.
I am just going to assume that everything is phonetic and to hope for the best. But so it was founded on September 23rd, 1889.
Wow.
It's based in Kyoto, Japan.
Okay.
And from 1889 to 1949, Nintendo was a card company, producing and marketing for Hanafuda cards. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but so they're sort of I've got a picture of it here, and maybe we can link that as well. It's a Nintendo poster from the early Meiji era, so that's cool.
Okay.
You can see they're really like beautifully decorated cards. There's some normal playing cards down here in the bottom as well, but all the cards were handmade, and then as it initially I believe just by Fusahiro Yamauchi himself, who is the founder of Nintendo. And so I believe he was initially hand making all of the cards. And as it began to gain in popularity, he hired assistants to mass produce the cards and keep up with the demand.
Yeah.
And so it sort of followed that model. He passed it on to his son. The company continued to expand and produce other kinds of cards, diversify their product. And so maybe I misread that. His son-in-law, he didn't have a son to pass it along to.
Okay.
But it's sort of stayed in the family and progressed. And as I said, so that's a 60-year chunk of history where they're just a card company.
Wow.
And so that's really interesting, first of all, just the sort of cultural origins of that, too.
Mm-hmm.
And so then from that point, Nintendo in 1953 started producing playing cards from plastic, so it started to modernize.
Yeah.
And then in 1959, Nintendo struck a deal with Disney, which was a big deal, to allow the use of Disney's characters on Nintendo's playing cards. Previously, Western playing cards were regarded as something similar to Hanafuda and Mahjong, so a device for gambling, basically. So that sort of had a tie-in to it culturally. And so then in 1966, Nintendo was transitioning and actually not doing terribly well in being a toy company, and so they continued to explore new ventures and sort of push the envelope, looking into developing electronic toys. And then 1972 to present, they started transitioning to video games. I didn't realize, honestly, that video games could go back all the way to 1972. But the first commercially available video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, have you heard of this? Was, let's see, it had a light gun accessory, the shooting gallery, which was made by Nintendo. So they made the little shooter.
It's that classic yellow or orange and white gun that you see in like the history of electronics section of a museum that you use to play like Duck Hunt and stuff, is basically what that little pistol is.
Right. And so basically that little endeavor, so just making one part of a very new console. Video games are purely conceptual at this point, other than this console. Nintendo just got ahead of the curve in seeing how successful video games were going to become, and dabble in them and research them and figure out how to market to people. And for a long time, they were, everything cutting edge was Nintendo. That's less the case now, but and I still love Nintendo games for sure, but I don't know that it's in the modern era that they're necessarily pushing the envelope of game design in that same way. But certainly at this time they were very much on the cutting edge, and so that leads to a lot of the things that we know. So the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, Game Boy, Super NES, then getting into Nintendo 64, which was the first console that we played on, that we ever played Mario games on, and that continues to evolve into Game Boy Advance, GameCube, and then Nintendo DS, which was huge when I was in elementary school. Everybody had to have a Nintendo DS, and everybody had to have a Wii. And then that definitely sort of faded off for a couple years. Like if you were still playing Wii games, that was sort of blasé. And then once the Nintendo Switch came out, which is the most recent iteration of a Nintendo console, that sort of pulled a bunch of people back in.
Well, they released the Wii U after the Wii, and that flopped tremendously.
yeah. But the Switch has been very successful for Nintendo. So anyway, I think that's so Nintendo is still by revenue the largest video game company in the world.
That does not surprise me. They have their hands in so many things.
Yeah. And so it's just, I think it's a fascinating thing in the story arc of their company that that goes all the way back to 1889, and starting with decorative card development, and now they're doing something so different, and but also continuing to be vibrant and creative and productive 140 years after their almost 130 years. Third time's the charm. 131 years specifically after their founding. So that's pretty cool, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then specifically talking about Mario Kart or Mario in general, sorry. That Mario also is older than I would have given him credit for.
Oh yeah.
So Super Mario Bros. Didn't debut until 1985, which still seems like a long time ago for Mario. But
35 years ago.
Mario himself appeared in Donkey Kong as Jumpman.
Oh, like yes, he was the player, basically.
Yeah, so he was running after his girlfriend, Pauline, who eventually, I assume, sort of more
becomes Peach.
Morphs into Princess Peach.
Yeah.
And Princess Peach was Princess Toadstool in early Mario.
Early, yeah.
So she's just... The girlfriend just keeps changing.
Can't get the story straight.
Yeah, but that was significant in the sort of user interface of Donkey Kong, you know, being able to jump and avoid obstacles, and also like running after Pauline through all these levels sort of established the damsel in distress trope, which was all video games were for a long time, or at least a big chunk of video game plot was like, you got your little dude and you need to go save your girlfriend. You know? And so
it's an easy plot hook.
Yeah, and I always thought that and this article says that it seems like Jumpman and Donkey Kong are sort of friendly rivals almost in the way that the game is presented, but the manual for Donkey Kong reveals that Donkey Kong is Jumpman's pet, and Donkey Kong was motivated to abduct Pauline due to being mistreated.
Oh, there's some weird lore with DK. It's very strange.
Yeah, which is very strange, especially because Donkey Kong in later games is very much like not a person, but like a thinking.
He's absolutely a sentient being.
Yeah, and
he has children and relatives, and
exactly, and he's the protagonist of his own sort of franchise, and so that was just interesting to me on a couple of levels, both on the changing image of Donkey Kong and just on the fact that Mario was kind of a bad dude in that first game, and he's very much not. And in fact, in Donkey Kong Jr., which was 1982, so a year after Donkey Kong came out, and 3 years to Super Mario Bros., Mario was very explicitly the antagonist. And so I didn't know that he had ever appeared as a bad guy.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
Was he called Mario at that point, or was he still Jumpman?
I think that he wasn't called Mario until Super Mario Bros. Came out in 85, but this article doesn't specifically talk about that. And so in Donkey Kong Jr., players, play as Donkey Kong Jr. To save Donkey Kong from Mario, who captured Donkey Kong. So that's interesting. And Mario is a man of many crafts. Everybody thinks of him as Mario the plumber, but he actually started as a carpenter. He's been portrayed as a doctor, so like Dr. Mario, which is a puzzle-solving game. And so that just him being a plumber from New York sort of is a part of his character that developed later in Mario Bros. So Mario Bros. Actually came out in 83, and then Super Mario Bros. Was 85. So that was my mistake from earlier. And so in 83, they're investigating New York sewers, and like after strange creatures began appearing there, and that's like the Koopas that are etc., etc.
I wondered how they landed on the kind of off-brand racist Italian sort of interpretation of Mario.
Definitely he's sort of there are lots of stereotypes associated with his general depiction, but he's sort of his own cultural icon at this point. And so I'm not saying it's not like problematic, but it's it's definitely not the focus when we talk about Mario.
I mean, but can you imagine the problem if they're like, we're gonna fix Mario? People would be like,
make him like PC. People would
not fly.
Upset. But I had literally never thought about like in Super Mario, like the pipes that you jump into, and that being like traced back to the sewers of New York.
It's just such a thing. Mario is such its own style in that way.
Right. And since this game is traced back to early 80s, and we didn't start playing them until the late 2000s, early 2010s, probably.
I mean, we had Super Mario N64, which came out in the late 90s.
But we started
playing it very late.
Yeah, and so it was such an established thing.
Yes.
By the time that we got to it, that it was just like, it's just Mario. You're just playing, and you just do it. And so that's kind of, I actually love talking about this because there's so much more than I really think about, and it dates back so much further than I would have thought it did. So, I'm actually just going through this article from Medium.com about just interesting Mario facts, because a lot of them are just really fun to discuss.
Yeah.
So I have about 5 minutes left, and so we'll just get through as many as we can.
Rapid fire.
Yeah. And so Mario was actually inspired by Popeye. So
I can see that.
Yeah. And so Shigeru Miyamoto, I don't remember who that is. He must be related to Nintendo in some way. Originally wanted to develop a Popeye game. Nintendo was unable to secure the license, so they created Donkey Kong, and that was a good decision because Donkey Kong has made them lots of money.
Oh yeah, he's one of the most famous video game developers of all time.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry, sir. Yeah. This is another like fun little quirky fact is Mario has his iconic handlebar mustache, and that was actually and his red Mario cap as well. And those were both introduced in the design exclusively because of technical limitations.
Really?
So the hat, because hair was really difficult to portray.
Hair is still hard.
Yeah, especially in just the 8-bit pixelated style. And the mustache helped emphasize the nose and hide the mouth, which would have been difficult to animate. And so, and they went with red for his costume design and his aggressive color scheme for his overalls, because it made him moving around more visible and noticeable. So
he'd pop out from the background.
So you can find where you are on the screen.
Yeah.
There was a Super Mario Bros. Movie in the 90s.
Oh, it was horrendous. Did terribly.
It was a total flop, so we're just going to skip right past that.
Not going to talk about that.
And this is total quirky anecdote. Universal Studios almost ended the franchise at the really early on because they tried to sue Donkey Kong with its King Kong patent. It was a whole thing, and initially it seemed like they were going to settle, and then Nintendo decided that they weren't going to settle the case and the lawsuit was going to go on, and then they unearthed that Universal didn't actually legally own the King Kong copyright. And so they used Universal's own argument against them to say, yeah, it does violate that, but you don't own it.
Don't have the copyright.
And so the case was dismissed. So
I'm just going to sidebar and give a little credit where credit is due to Shigeru Miyamoto here.
Yes, sir, I am uneducated.
He was the first artist for the video game division of Nintendo, period. He created Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda in their entirety. And his games have been flagships of every Nintendo video game console from the arcade machines of the late 70s until present.
Yeah.
He's a very big deal.
And in my last 2 minutes, I just... there's actually more than I thought to talk about. We could keep going, but...
Nope.
But in the last couple minutes, I just want to go ahead and slam home to I'm 20 years old, so 15-year-old arguments that we had a lot in my childhood.
I wonder where this is going.
So there are two big ones. One's beef with you and one's beef with mom. And so first of all, a new study suggests that Mario Kart does in fact make you a better driver by increasing your reaction time, or decreasing your reaction time, I guess, and making you better at processing information. And I always said that I was gaining valuable life skills from playing lots of Mario Kart. So take that. And second of all, I always complained in Mario Party at not getting to be player one. and you would always beat me in Mario Party because I had no motor skills until I was 15. And so I was like, it's because you're player one, just deflect blame a little bit for my own ineptitude. And so that probably wasn't the reason that I was 0 and 150 in Mario Party games for much of my childhood.
You're also 3 years younger than I was.
Yeah. But
bombshell revelation coming in.
Mario Party for Nintendo 64, in chance-based minigames, if there are identical inputs from player 1 and player 2, the system defaults to award the victory to player 1. And thusly, I would like to retroactively claim at least a third of the games of Mario Party from when we were kids, because if I had been player 1, I would have won a lot more. So, basically, like, I just wanted this to be sort of lighthearted review of a company that I have lots of love in my heart for, but also caused me lots of pain through the player 1 gimmicks, and also just me not being very good at video games. But
I will say that not everything is sunshine and rainbows with Nintendo. They're extremely aggressive with their copyright things, to the point that like fan-made games get taken down for copyright claims, and like you can't even play music from Nintendo games because they'll so aggressively come after you. So not all things about Nintendo is great, but they are perhaps the single most influential video game company of all time to this point.
Yeah.
Perhaps because they're one of the first.
Mario is, that was another study I was going to bring up earlier, that Mario is more recognizable to American children than Mickey Mouse.
Wow.
And so that's like, you know, I always think of Mickey Mouse as like sort of the flag bearer of just, you know, childhood media, I guess. And
well, and 50 years older than Mario.
Sure, yeah.
Because he was the 20s or something.
Right, exactly. And Mario is in fact more recognizable. So I guess I could jump in a later episode and talk about everything that Nintendo does wrong, but I'm just talking about the games here.
No, and not everything has to have a negative spin. Yeah. We can just enjoy it.
We just wanted this one to be a little bit more fun than last week, where it was serial killers and super bacteria. Yep. You know, that was a little tough for us. So anyway,
well, this was a fun diversion from a lot of the content that we've been doing recently, as you said. I hope that you all appreciate it. Those of you who are watching, if you have things that you are interested in hearing us talk about, as we say at the end of every episode, please let us know. We would love. We are always trying to come up with ideas, and so, of course, any amount of work that we do not have to do
is great.
Is fantastic.
We love to not do things, actually.
But honestly, if you have things that you're interested in hearing us talk about, please let us know. And as always, we appreciate those of you for checking out the content, and we all hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for hanging out, guys. See you next time.
Take care.